All right, we're back with another Tanya shiur. I think this one is going to be under half an hour. This one is going to be the one. We're a little bit behind on the recording schedule. I wanted to give a lot of shiur on Paragraph Test. I don't know that it's going to end up happening, but there is one shiur that I do very much want to give on Paragraph Test. It shouldn't be too long. It's really just linguistic nitpicking. To call it nigla is a little bit of a stretch. Not that any of these shiurim are nigla, but they are somewhat nigla focused. But I do think that the amount of research kind of takes it away from what you would expect necessarily this to be, and the fact that we have this amount of just investigation seems to warrant it being an in-depth shiur and not just a sidetrack. But that being said, what is a shiur? What is a drasha, if not a sidetrack? So, without further ado, let's get into it. In Paragraph Test of Likutei Amarim Tanya, the Alter Rebbe says he's talking about advice that we need to give for ourselves, that how to drive ourselves forward in avodah. And what he says, he's talking about how we can inspire ourselves and to appreciate the lowliness of the physical so that we can have and arouse mercy on the spiritual, on the soul that's stuck inside of us. And so he says, particularly when a person remembers the impurity of their soul with the sins of youth, and the blemish which was created in the upper realms, and in the upper realms, the concept of time doesn't exist, it's above time. And so when a person sinned and they caused a blemish in the upper realms, it's as though they did that avera today. And Alter Rebbe continues, he says that even though a person does tshuva, there's always deeper tshuva that you can do, very related to Ramam of this tkufa. Nowadays, we're finishing Hilchos Tshuva soon. So, yeah, this is the concept that is discussed in Tanya. Now, really, we can keep on getting into this. And also, the Alter Rebbe says, someone that's clean of the more stringent chatas neurim from the worst chatas neurim, Yasan Liba, the Kayim, Mitzvah Kadesh, the Chujvna, etc. Alter Rebbe elaborates further. So, the thing that I was asked about was, what is chatas neurim? Now, you'll see a lot of translations of Tanya where chatas neurim refers to the spilling of seed, the worst of the sins that young people tend to do, at least as far as people like to frame it. It's something that's, not to turn the blind eye to it, it's probably one of the most prevalent quote-unquote averes, especially of averes that people do with a guilty feeling, and also of averes that people do that's, I would say, to a certain extent conscious, like let's say Lashon Hara. Usually people will find the justification why it's not really Lashon Hara. The other person deserves it, and so for some reason in their mind that justifies it. I'm referencing Lashon Hara because Lashon Hara is one of the most common averes. It says that there are three things that someone is nitzel from every day, and one of them is Sefach Lashon Hara. You also have Hira Avera. This is actually something that we discussed in an earlier shiur. But you also have Hira Avera, and also people come up with different kinds of excuses in their mind. We actually also in Rambam and Hilchos Tshuva, the Rambam discusses that it's very easy to justify it. What's a person really doing already? They're just having a thought in their mind. What's so bad about it? So people could have different kinds of justifications. For Zer Lavatala, I think it's a little bit harder for people to make that justification in their mind. As in, they're doing it, it's an Avera, they know it's an Avera, and so they do it regardless. You do have, not to get into too many specific details before at least we get into all of the other specific details, but you do have the idea that exists. It's said in Zohar to be one of the worst Averis. You actually have something very interesting that in, I think it's Evan Ezer and Simon Chafei, could have been Chaim Rishmam, they're both very similar Simonim, but that you actually have that, the basis, of course, the opinion of the Rosh and other Rishonim about different details that relate to it. I think it was actually referring to Rabbeinu Tam, a certain opinion of Rabbeinu Tam that relates to the Sugya, and in Beder Kabayis he goes back and he says, if you would have seen what the Zohar says about it, then Lav Dafka would he say what he said. So it's something that's said to be very chomer. On the other hand, you have the Beis Shmuel in Siman Chav Gimel, if I'm not mistaken, and he says that Lav Dafka is the worst Avera, and there's a lot to be said about the sugya. But we're not here necessarily to talk about Zer Lavatala. We're here to talk about, is chatas neurim Zer Lavatala? Is that what it is? Is it one and the same, or is it? I mean, there's two other options technically. Firstly, that there's no connection. It's just chatas neurim is its own thing, and it refers to its own sug, its own sugya, and Zer Lavatala is its own thing. That's another option. And then the option that I'm really going to put forward, just to spill the beans out, is that chatas neurim is a class of averis, and really it's a class of averis that people do when they're younger. It's when a person sometimes rises to a certain level. We say that every level that you go to, as the Alter Rebbe elaborates in Paragraph Test, you could always do tshuva on earlier averis. And so when we go through life, it's important to look back at where we were and what we've become, and also have a healthy appreciation that even though we've definitely moved on, and it's important to move on, but we're also still the same person, and it could continue to push us forward. And it's a healthy thing to take some time, not to think about it all the time. To think about it all the time, it's not healthy. It's not good for Avodas Hashem. Again, these are all things elaborated on in Parak Chatas, but it's good to look back and think about where we were and how far we've come, and also to have a little bit of merirus that these Averos are still around, as the Alter Rebbe again elaborates in Parak Chatas. I encourage learning Parak Chatas, even if it's just a standalone thing. It's great, very Moser. But I digress. Ultimately, that's what I believe chatas neurim is, and it does happen to be that I would say for the vast majority of people, of sexually healthy human beings, that Zera Levatala is probably one of those areas that people will be able to look back on and think, wow, Taka, I've moved on from there, especially when people get married, especially nowadays that the norm is to get married much later. There's probably much more of a prevalence of Zera Levatala, because in a practical sense, and that is to say in a strict halachic sense, Kabbalistically, Zera Levatala is something that even married people could very easily be nichshel in, and talk to your local Orthodox rabbi or local Orthodox Kabbalist about those details. Again, I don't want to be going into halacha share right now, but ultimately, Zera Levatala, in a strict halachic sense, is something that is probably more committed nowadays with marriage being pushed off. But even in the Alter Rebbe's days, it's still definitely something that people had a rough time with. And even married people, as Bez Hashem, we're going to discover a little bit in the shiur. And so essentially, I was asked the question, I gave the answer. The person said, okay, then they said that the Rebbe actually has a reference to Perek Zayin. And we'll get to that later after I go through some of the interesting sources that have what to do with Zera Levatala being mentioned earlier. So the first thing that I'll say for kind of to deduce a little bit of support for the notion that chatas neurim doesn't necessarily equate to Zera Levatala is that there's a work that is often referenced as being something that chasanim should be learning before they get married. The Rebbe often referenced it, so at least in Chabad circles it's referenced. I believe that also in Welt, in the Litv Shevelt, etc. This is something which is learned, which is the Rishis Chachma, Shar Kedusha, Perek Tes Zayin and Yud Zayin. Perek Tes Zayin is more about Kedushas Tashmish, and Perek Yud Zayin is more about the notion of Zera Levatala. There's actually a lot of different inyanim that are referenced over there. Different levels of Zera Levatala, not just in the physical strict sense, but also like Brach Levatala is a certain kind of Zera Levatala, he explains over there, etc., etc. Very interesting stuff. I strongly recommend checking it out if you're a chasan, even if you're not yet a chasan, or even if you're already a chasan, but it's still interesting things to check out. In Reishis Chachma, he has a full chapter on the idea of Zera Levatala, and the term chatas neurim doesn't really come up over there. Now, you could find that it came up later, that it only entered the lexicon later, but still interesting to note, at least that at this point, which the Reishis Chachma was a Talmud of the Ramak, if I'm not mistaken, who was a Kabbalist that was also arguably a teacher of the Arizal. I wouldn't make such a strong argument for that, but there's a lot to be said about the Sugya, a teacher of Chaim Vital. I think there's a very good sentiment to be had about that. I would argue that. So a teacher of the Reishis Chachma, a teacher of Chaim Vital, and yeah, the Reishis Chachma. So essentially, someone, if you would say, someone of the generation of the Arizal, he was talking about, he had a whole subject, a little bit encyclopedic about the topic, and he does not get into it. The Menera Samar is another work written by Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab. I do not believe he's the famous Mari Abuhab. I think he's earlier than him. And he wrote a Sefer Moser, Menera Samar, and the Menera Samar is referenced at the beginning of these chapters of Reishis Chachma. He says to see there about a lot of other details. That's why the Reishis Chachma mainly goes into Kabbalistic inyanim. He says that a lot of Divrei Chazal, etc., are already referenced in Menera Samar, and to repeat it would be duplicitous, if that's the word. And again, Menera Samar doesn't really have a reference to it. There is actually a poem in there, if I'm not mistaken, that does have a reference to it. But again, chatas neurim is actually something that it's a phrase from Tanakh a little bit. It comes up in Parak Chafei of Tehillim. It also comes up, I believe, in Shmuel about the Kohanim, that they would essentially be scamming the people, and the chatas neurim was very great. L'chayr not referring to Zera Levatala, although maybe you can really try to dash in that, because there is something that said that the children of Eli, that they were pushing off the components of women. It's okay. It's a complicated Josh, but just bear with me for a second. They're pushing off the Karbanis woman, and that's why the pasuk compares them that as though they were being matame, the wives of the people that were coming, because it says that they were essentially pushing off their ability to have tashmish because the women were being mu'ukav in the Beis Hamikdash so that their Karbanis could be brought, and so they were essentially stealing that right from their husbands. So the pasuk is mailed on them as though they were essentially sleeping with married women. And so technically speaking, you can maybe try to make some kind of dasha to click it in, but at the end of the day, it's very far-fetched. The chatas neurim, no connection. And also, David Melch says in Tehillim, chatas neurim for al tizker, and not really much of a connection. So the idea is that you have this phrase, it exists. It's been floated around in different piyutim. We do say it actually in the machzer. We say it in the piyutim of Yom Kippur. I mean, at least people that say the piyutim say it in the piyutim of Yom Kippur. It's after the whole Aveda, after Marakain. You have a whole acrostic aleph phase and a lot of things that we have and that we don't have, and etc. In that whole list of things, we mentioned the phrase of chatas neurim. Ultimately, again, not really any kind of distinct, apparent connection to the idea of zera levatala. Now, I will say that once we go to, again, a bender of the Rishis Chochma, we get something that's a very interesting reference to chatas neurim in the context of zera levatala. You're going to have to bear with me for a second. It's in Shar HaGilgolim. Shar HaGilgolim is a fascinating work, and there's a lot of canon or headcanon about different neshamis and how they're megalgal. So something very interesting. Reb Chaim Vital is writing about himself, what the Arizal told him about himself. So essentially, the Arizal told him that he's a gilgal of a great many people, and that includes Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And he says that in this whole chain of Gilgolim, of these holy people, that really they're all from the seed that was emitted from Yosef's fingertips. The story is that the wife of Potiphar, Yosef's master, Yosef's mistress, I should say, but mistress sounds bad in this context, especially because he wasn't actually with her. She wanted to be with him, and maybe he wanted to be with her also. It's a machlokes if he actually wanted to be with her. But at the end of the day, she cornered him, and they were going to maybe do the deed. And at the end of the day, Yosef saw the image of his father, and so he pressed his fingernails into the ground, and from his 10 fingers were emitted 10 drops of seed, and that's why Yosef was originally supposed to have 12 shvatim, and he only ended up having 2, so they say. And so it's said in Shar HaGilgolim that these droplets of seed from Yosef HaTzadik, when he resisted doing the Avera with the wife of his master, so the neshamis of these great holy people are actually from that seed. Yosef HaTzadik, they didn't go for waste, but the neshamis actually, there are neshamis that came from this seed. And those neshamis include the neshamis of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and apparently Reb Chaim Vital. Now, the Arizal told Reb Chaim Vital that because these neshamis are from such a source, they're from the essentially zera levatala, because it is seed that came out of Yosef's fingers. It didn't go into a woman. It wasn't necessarily done for a mitzvah. Whether it was done for a mitzvah is complicated in and of itself, but there's a certain, at least, way to correlate it to zera levatala in a very practical sense. And so, because these neshamas are from that source, they have much more of a susceptibility to chatas and neurim. And it's interesting the way that Reb Chaim Vital kind of proves this is that he says the Gemara Mesachim. It says Rabbi Akiva originally lived the first 40 years of his life as an Am Haaretz, and Rabbi Akiva, being an Am Haaretz back in the day, wasn't just a person that didn't know how to learn. There were different social classes, and I could give a whole share about this on itself, but I don't want to get too sidetracked. Again, I am trying to keep this to under half an hour. But the idea exists that it was its own kind of social class, and there was a lot of clashing between the Chachamim or the Prushim and the Amei Aretz, depending on which generation. There's a lot of different ways you can split the terms. The point of the matter is that Rabbi Akiva was an Amei Aretz for the first 40 years of his life, and he didn't like Chachamim. And he said if he would see one of the Chachamim, he'd give them a vicious bite. It's essentially what he said. So Reb Chaim Vital says, well, you see that if he's Pasha and Amei Aretz like this, l'chera he has chatas neurim. So this is the word that he says, essentially. And he says the same thing for Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And so he says that they, l'chera, had chatas neurim. Then he says something very fascinating about himself. He says that he himself, it's a very interesting phrase. I need to do more research into it. But he says that he himself was kidnapped. I need to read the Lashon. The Lashon is just very interesting and important. He's saying, the Arizal is talking to him. And he says, that for the fact that I am a Gilgal of theirs, that's why I came to this sin. I was tied up on the day of my wedding when I went into the chuppah. I was tied up for 9 months straight. And it was forced that I would admit carry the vatala bizmanahu in this time. So he said essentially that he was kidnapped on his wedding day, and he was tied up for 9 months, and he was forced to do Zera Levatala. And in this context at the beginning, he refers to this idea as chatas neurim. It's not mamish one-to-one. He doesn't say that the chatas carries chatas neurim. He says that because Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, they were Amayaretz originally, so it's certainly that they had chatas neurim. And then he goes on to say this vart, and it's definitely related to the idea of the tipas zera of Yosef Tzadik. Again, it's not mamish one-to-one necessarily. It's not that he says, it's not that he equates them, but you have this correlation. I will say, someone suggested to me, and it shtickle fits, that maybe when he says that he was kidnapped on his wedding day, he was tied off, there is an idea out there that he was married twice, and that the first marriage was not a good marriage, for whatever reason, and there is apparently a sefer somewhere, I need to get my hands on the sefer, where it's discussed, as in the notion of his first marriage. It's possible that when he's saying that he was tied up for 9 months, it maybe has something to do, maybe because his first wife was pregnant or something like that, he felt trapped in the marriage. I don't know exactly the details. It's a really fascinating notion. Also, what kind of forcing there is for Zera Levatala in 9 months, he was tied up, he had the taiva, is that what it was? He also mentions over there that he had a lot of gaiva, and that maybe that's another reason why he was kidnapped and tied up. Another fault of his. There's a lot of interesting inyanim going on in this. I don't pretend to know exactly. It's a very fascinating concept, but this is what he writes. So you have over here a little bit a light correlation of the terms. This is another reference to the story, also in Shar Golgolim. This is mainly in Hakdama Lamed Ches. So yeah, I would say that this is up there with the references of chatas and urim being correlated to Zera Levatala. Another one that's, I would say, up there is the Shalah. The Alter Rebbe had a lot of respect for the Shalah. They say that the Alter Rebbe, before he came into Chassidus, he was more of a Shalah Yid. Shalah wrote a lot of Svarim, there's a lot of guidance, and how to live a life of a Musar. And very interesting stuff, quoted often enough. Not for some reason, it's very hard to read it if you're not living by it. It's very lengthily, and you got to really throw yourself into it. But it is interesting stuff to just pick up and read. You could read a long shtickle for a while. But he does say in Shar Osius and Hilchas Bia, he uses the term chatas neurim. He says Misha Horgel b'chatas neurim b'ma'aseh ka'urim v'alachal tzarza. He says someone that's accustomed to chatas neurim with disgusting actions, and he comes to Zera Levatala. So is this necessarily saying that chatas neurim is Zera Levatala? Again, niglah'dike, when he says chatas neurim, what is he necessarily referring to? It could be like her avera, for example. That's not necessarily chatas neurim in and of itself, but it's something that would definitely lead to chatas neurim. But again, you have a correlation. He does also say, he has in his Maseches Yoma, there's I can't be explaining the whole structure of the Shlah, but he does have a section where he has 10 Masechtes, and essentially Chulin is about weekday stuff, and then every Yom Tif is the Masechta for that Yom Tif. You have Shabbos, and you also have Psachim and Yoma, etc. So Yoma is about Yom Kippur, so he's talking about doing tshuva, and he lists chatas and urim with a bunch of common averes. He does not on that list have also the sin of Zera Levatala, but he does also have there Staklis Benashim, so that would maybe be a little bit of a further push to say that the Shal is maybe referring to chatas and urim as Zera Levatala, because it takes away something at least from the thing that you have in Shar Osius, to say that chatas and urim over there referred to her, because apparently chatas and urim is not her, because you have it listed along with, it's not her, it's a Staklis Benashim, but essentially along those lines. With that being said, the Shla also, in his Maseches Yoma, he has another line talking about tshuva, and for someone that's learning Tanya, this is definitely a good thing to bring out, where I think that he kind of isn't necessarily using chatas and urim to mean that, to mean Zera Levatala all-inclusively. And what he says, it's very funny, because the Pasha goes against the spirit of Tanya, but he says in Maseches Brachos, it says, Amar Rabba Kigan Rabbeinu, I believe he has the Gersa of Rava, Amar Rava Kigan Rabbeinu, and essentially it's the conversation that's brought at the beginning of Tanya, wherein Rava says that he's a Beinoni, Abaya says, if you're a Beinoni, then what are we? And so the Alter Rebbe explains that really Rava thought about himself that he's a Beinoni because he thought maybe he's like a Beinoni that's constantly involved in Avodah, that the Beinoni would have it would not be able to observe any practical difference between themselves and a tzaddik. So that's why Rava said that he's like a Beinoni. If Rava were really, or Rava, the Alter Rebbe has the Gersa of Rava, that's the Gersa that we have. If Rabba were Taka really Beinoni, maybe you'd be able to have this claim. But no, L'chira Rabba wasn't actually Beinoni. L'chira Rabba was actually a tzaddik, although technically speaking, who's the observer that's gonna call the shot? But Abaye was saying that I can't fathom that you're taka benoni because you're dach v'tzadik kader. So, but what the shloch says is he says that if Rava thought that he's like a benoni, that we should take it. Amr le Abaye is a good vart of Musar, that if Rava could have been a benoni, then what are we? And so he says that our generation, that we have so much chatas and neurim, and we don't have a lot of Torah, etc. So what are we? Who are we that we're supposed to be anything? What are we considered for? So essentially, what he's saying is he's just taking this to me of Abaye and he's rolling with it. He's saying that Taka Rava maybe could have been a benoni. So in that case, what are we? As in, for us, we learn Tanya, and we're not really disheartened the way that Abaye expresses his shock, because we say, okay, Rava isn't Taka benoni. Rava is Taka Tzaddik. It's a little bit hard to go back and forth with this, but Rava is Taka Tzaddik, and he thought that he's a benoni. He was able to convince himself he's a benoni because, for all intents and purposes, in his mind, he was constantly doing avodah. So there was no distinguishable difference between himself and a benoni. But for the shlah, he's saying no, taka. Maybe he was actually a benoni. But with that being said, he uses the term chatas and neurim in a completely not really zera levatala context. He just uses it as a throwaway term. So I'm tempted to say that it is more of a throwaway term, and he's using. Sometimes you want to use it. You want to say like nod to a certain avera. You don't. It's not that chatas and neurim itself is the nod. It's not the wink itself. It's just a term that you use for averas that a person does when they're younger. Averas that were done earlier, as in not averas that a person's struggling with now, but earlier averas. And essentially, it's just a term that exists in the vacuum, kind of. A few interesting references that I found to this idea, other than this. First, I will mention that it comes up in Akedah Yitzchak. It's also in a list of averas, nothing really particular to be noted. It's just a term that's thrown around. Akedah Yitzchak is, for anyone that doesn't know, is a sefer from Rabbi Yitzchak Arma. And he was a darshan in the days of the Spanish Inquisition, if I'm not mistaken. So, a Moser Sefer, it's a famous Sefer. So, just something that I found in my searching. There's probably much more searching to be done. I'm not an expert in searching. I just figured I would look in at least, Kisvei Ari and the Shlah, which are two great influences on the Alter Rebbe, because ultimately what we're trying to come over here was trying to figure out what the Alter Rebbe's intention is in Tanya. As far as nowadays, I do think that practically speaking, if someone were to be writing a Sefer and they'd write chatas and neurim, they'd probably be referring to zera levatala. I think that is how it evolved in the modern lexicon. It's a phrase, it's an innuendo, it's whatever you want to call it, something that refers to zera levatala in a practical sense nowadays. But we need to look at what was actually going on in the Alter Rebbe's times. How are people actually perceiving it? So, with that being said, there is a reference. The Chassam Sofer it's very interesting. The Chassam Sofer was only about 18 years younger than the Alter Rebbe, and didn't live that much longer than him either. And it's really very interesting. It's two different sides of the story, maybe you would think, at least in my perception, to think that no, that Taka were in roughly the same generation, so I think it is at least worth mentioning. He does use chatas and neurim technically once in a tshuva that I was able to find. He uses it for bestiality. You could do with that what you will. Maybe that's a very extreme form of zera levatala. I think it's really just a throwaway term. In Shilas Yavetz, he does use the phrase. He is using it to apologize. His chatas and neurim is that he didn't respond early enough, so technically it was an earlier avera because he has overcome it, because apparently he's doch writing the letter. But at the end of the day, again, it's not really something that necessarily seems to lend to the idea that it's something that means in those times. The Yavetz is a little bit before the Alter Rebbe, but again, it doesn't really seem to imply that in those times chatas and neurim necessarily meant that wink that we have nowadays, that it means zera levatala. In Chabad sources, you have a mimer of the Alter Rebbe, which normally the mimer of the Alter Rebbe are a little bit tricky to be quoting if you're trying to get an opinion from the Rebbeim. And the reason why is because you have a lot of mimerim, and the mimerim have different grisayis. And b'chlal, I'm already a little bit of a stickler when it comes to non-muktik sources, because how do you know how accurate it is necessarily? There's the Sikh of the Rebbe, where the Rebbe has about the date of the Baal Shem Tov's passing, and there's the Sikh of the Friedrich Rebbe. The Rebbe says certainly the people that transcribed it meant well, but if you add in an extra word to this statement, then everything really clicks in. So l'chayr, they just forgot the word. So I'm a little bit hesitant to start making blanket statements based on these non-muktik maimarim, especially because it just seems like it was the personal notes of Chassidim based on the maimarim that they heard. And while I definitely love and appreciate the Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe's days, it's a little bit hard to say that it's mamish Torah l'Moshe Misinai, but you could say maybe it has the status for Brisa, that if the wording is not so clear, then maybe you could start editing the wording, etc., etc. I'm not here to start giving my full opinion on that. Because ultimately, in this context, it actually makes no difference, because if the Chassidim are using Zera Lavatala, or are using chatas neurim to refer to Zera Lavatala, then that means that, practically speaking, that is how it was being used in those days. Whether or not it was the direct exact wording of the Alter Rebbe, it means that in their minds, that is how it existed. That being said, it seems actually, once we start getting there, that chatas neurim does not actually mean Zera Lavatala. I did not find too many references. I found a reference in Maimari Adhaz in the Inyan of Tshuva, so it's in the Sefer of Maimari Adhaz in Yonim. So there's different gersos. One gersa has no mention of chatas neurim. The other one says that chatas neurim sai in Loshin and sai in Bris Hamor. And Bris Hamor is referring to Shazal, it says explicitly over there. But you see that chatas neurim is more of a catch-all, that it means the Averis people do when they're younger, and one of them is in Bris Haloshin. And Bris Haloshin is a concept similar to the idea of Zera Lavatala, that you guard the physical bris, but you also guard the Loshin. You guard your tongue from doing all of the Averis that a person can very, very, very easily do with talking, and that includes Dvarim Matelim and things like that. Also more Chomer Averis like Lashon Hara, and there's a lot of Averis that could be done with the tongue, and it's more of a Kabbalistic concept. Obviously, that's besides for the halachic aspect of all of the Averis that are actually being done, with the idea of there being particular significance that gives it the term of Bris Haloshin, Kabbalistic concept, and whoever it is that was transcribing this mimer, as in the second person, not the person that made it into the main text, the person that made it into the footnote, but his Girsa had this mention of chatas neurim, and chatas neurim is referring to the Averis that he was doing when he was younger. And, or not necessarily the Averis that he was doing that he was younger. It's possible the Alter Rebbe did enumerate Averis, but it wasn't just explicitly Zera Lavatala, it was other Averis that are in the mix. You have a few references to the phrase chatas neurim in Luchot Torah. None of them really said anything one way or another about Zera Lavatala. Not really anything to be said, but just at least a sniff. I would say that the main thing that really piqued my interest is you do have something that's technically speaking Muga. And it's a little bit of a journey, so you have to bear with me. There is a sefer called Pekach Ivrim. And in Pekach Ivrim, or the Pekach Ivrim is from the Alter Rebbe, it is, to call it a sefer is a little bit generous, it's more of a contrast. It's what we would call very, very tiny, something like 20 pages or so. And it's from the Alter Rebbe, and it's a hadracha for tshuva and inyanim like that. I couldn't find the original version. I wanted to find the original version. The earliest version I could find is from Tov Kuf Tzadik Beis, which is a couple of years after the Alter Rebbe passed away. And the reason why I'm a little bit hesitant to trust it is because it became so prolific. It was really very well published. It was something that people were putting out as an addendum to so many different works. And so it's really out there. It became something that's very well published, and it also got a lot of different changes. I did find versions of Pekach Ivrim that does not have the line that I'm referring to. However, I would say that the version from Tov Kuf Tzadik Beis is the earliest version I could find. Shortly after his passing, I can't vouch for its accuracy. I can't vouch for who, how, when, where, what it was published. Everything gets, some little mistakes, even things that are published by the Rabbeim Mechal, so it's possible for there to be a typo here and there. I hope I'm not going to get lynched for saying that. But typos happen, shigis miyavin. Even Tanya, in the introduction of Tanya, it says that there are a lot of things that are getting published here and there. You have in Nigras HaKodesh, we'll get to other shiurim over there, but you have that, you have certain things that are wondrous about the Lashon, different gersos, etc., and these things pop up. It happens when you do other printings. So you do have some printings where the line that I'm about to say is not there, but if you take this line, you say that's from the Alter Rebbe and that it was published immediately after, so it must have been by the Tzemach Tzedek or people close, etc., then you would have, I would say your case is a little bit open and shut. Essentially what he says over there, he's talking about the sources of doing tshuva and to not get too involved in all of the bad things. So a person actually needs to be broken from their earlier averis, or I should say, a person needs to be zubrochen von seine chatas and orim v'rorim roim v'chatoim v'afilu min avon kari moisi zera lavatala rachman and so on. So essentially what he's saying is you have a person needs to be broken from their chatas and orim and from their horim roim and from their averis v'chlal, and even from avon kari, which is a very bad thing. So if you're having it in that listing, then it definitely seems to be that they weren't looking at chatas and orim as being its own standalone thing. That they weren't looking at chatas and orim as being zera lavatala. Chatas and orim was its own standalone thing. Was the notion of averis that were done when a person was younger, because any person that rose a certain dagger probably wasn't at the dagger when they were younger. They rose to it later, and so they have their averis from when they're younger to be worried about and to feel bad about. And in a certain sense, honestly, Tanya doesn't really work too well. It works, but it works much better if you have a little bit of chatas orim to give you a healthy dose of humility. Michlal. And in general, you have a lot of Maimarim that conflate the notion of a tzaddik and a Baal Tshuva. A tzaddik can also be a Baal Tshuva, and part of what drives a tzaddik being a Baal Tshuva is to recognize their dagra. There's a story with Baal Shem Tov. I'm not concluding with this because I still need to transfer with the Rebbe's reference to Perek Zayin. And I think with that we'll conclude. But there is a story of the Baal Shem Tov that I very much like, that there was a person who lived in a town, and once his wagon wasn't really working, he ended up riding into town on Shabbos. The town Rav told him that it's a very grievous sin, and he asked for a way of tshuva. That is to say, the burgher asked for a way of tshuva, and the Rav gave him a very strict regimen. And according to the Kabbalistic Svarim, maybe it was right, maybe it wasn't, who knows. But this is what the Rav prescribed. At one point, the Baal Shem Tov was in a nearby town, and this guy was either told or he had the idea himself to go to the Baal Shem Tov, because sometimes, you ask a bigger place and they have more Brayta places, and they're able to give you an easier time. So I figured maybe the Baal Shem Tov is able to lighten his load that he's partially struggling every day to do tshuva for the fact that his wagon rode into town after Lichtzinin. So Baal Shem Tov essentially tells him that he should donate candles to Shul for Shabbos, and that'll be his kapara. So he's thrilled, he's overjoyed, he goes back home, and that's what he does. And the Rav sees him happy, and he's like, "Why are you happy? You shouldn't be happy for another 3 years." And so the guy says, "No, the Baal Shem Tov told me." So the Rav said, "Really? I don't know." The Baal Shem Tov, so he went back to the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov said, "No, this talk about I said, you got it right." And he said, "Tell your Rav that he should come to me." Okay, so the guy goes back, and he tells the Rav, and so the Rav figured that the Rav is not doubting the Baal Shem Tov per se. At least it's not how I heard the story. The Rav isn't doubting the Baal Shem Tov, but he wants to hear what the Baal Shem Tov has to say for how he's able to prescribe this for tshuva. And so he heads out to the Baal Shem Tov, and he was told to spend Shabbos with the Baal Shem Tov. So he heads out on Friday. It's not too far away, but his wagon breaks down, and the wheel is repair, and then he keeps going, and then one of the horses is too weak, and et cetera, et cetera. And by the time that he rolls into town, he gets to the address of the Baal Shem Tov exactly as the Baal Shem Tov is picking up his cup to make Kiddush. And the Baal Shem Tov tells him, "Now you know what it's like to be broken with the need for tshuva. Now you can spend Shabbos as a Baal Tshuva." And as far as the moral of the story, it seems to be that there's a certain point of the Tzibrakhenkeit that it's able to push you further in your Avodah. This Rav was a very upstanding individual, and in his mind, that you look at what the Svarim say, and the Svarim prescribe how you're supposed to make a kapara, etc. But ultimately, the Tzibrakhenkeit that a person gets when they appreciate what it means they did in Avera and chatas negdi samid, I should say chatasi negdi samid, but I don't want to make this personal. But at the end of the day, this is a very big driving force. It's a very good driving force in Avodah. And we're born down here. It says Adam Lamul Yolid, Yivalid, Adam Amul Yolad. I think that's the Nikud. Don't quote me. But we come down here, we do Averis, and who can make Torah from Tameh, Lo Echad, and ultimately this is life. It's a Yerid L'Tzerech Aliyah. Now to get back to Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, 32 minutes in, I think we'll make it 35 minutes. Shouldn't be too long, and I'll say that I'm happy with that. The Rebbe references with chatas neurim, he directly references the end of Perek Zayin of Tanya. And so the end of Perek Zayin of Tanya, for anyone that's familiar, or if they remember chatas pretty well, the end of Perek Zayin of Tanya is referring to Zera Levatala. There's a discussion over there about Zera Levatala, and the Alter Rebbe says over there, B'chlal in Perek Zayin, he's talking about different levels of tshuva, and he says that about Zera Levatala, he says for other kinds of tshuva, you could say Zenes Nasa like Zachias, that your Averis become like Zachias. So, but then he says about Zera Levatala, he says the tipis of the chayas of the tipis Zera that comes out of Levatala, it's included in Shalosh Kapos Atmeis. There's no way really to elevate it. That's why we say Kriyash Mashal Amita to try to kill all of these klippis. But ultimately, Zera Levatala is not even mentioned in the Torah, and even though it's more chomer, the reason why is because Zera Levatala ultimately there's no real lasting effect permanently physically in the world. It's just adding keiches in the klippa. This is not the case. If a person has bias asuris, the bias asuris could actually cause the zera to, have a physical manifestation. It's not just about the zera. The avera has a physical manifestation. Sorry, I'm tripping over those words. There is an interesting chakira to be had, and maybe we'll get into it at some point. Maybe in Yigas Hatshuva, I don't know. We'll see at some point, maybe. But there is an interesting chakira to be had, which the Rebbe brings. It's not my chakira; it's the Rebbe's, about. Is Zera Levatala and Bias Asuris necessarily the same thing? Is it not necessarily the same thing, but is it that every Bias Asuris has Zera Levatala? There's a good argument to be had that it's not necessarily Zera Levatala. Why? Because a person could have Bias Asuris, make a mamzer, and the mamzer helps him fulfill the mitzvah of Puruvu. You're Yosef Puruvu with a mamzer. So At least there is this davar nafot that a person is disapproval with mamzer. So you have mitzvahs that a person can fulfill with bias asuris, even though the kid is a mamzer. So you have that idea that exists. Ultimately, I would say that they're not actually the same thing. I mean, this is the Rebbe's conclusion. It's not my conclusion again. But ultimately, this is all beside the point. Why is the Rebbe referencing the end of Perek Zayin of Tanya? I think it's very simple. Not that the Rebbe is saying that chatas and neurim is necessarily one-to-one with Zera L'Vatala. I think that what the Rebbe is referring to is that this exact concept applies for what the Alter Rebbe is referring to in Perek Chavtes, that ultimately a person always has chatas negdi samid, and Zera L'Vatala is a perfect example of an avera that you look at it and you say that the Chachamim say that there's no way to elevate it. Unless a person does tshuva me'ava, which is something that's discussed in the Rishis Chachma. Maybe that'll get its own shiur also. I don't know. We'll have to say there's a lot of good shiurim to be had about this concept. And ultimately, the idea is that a person really needs to do a deep level of tshuva, and each deep level of tshuva, you can keep on doing a deeper tshuva, as the Alter Rebbe again discussed in Perek Chavtes, is the concept in Perek Chavtes. But I believe what the Rebbe is referring to when he references the end of Perek Zayin about the line chatas and neurim is that chatas and neurim is these things that you pasha can't shake. You can't shake it, and that's what the Alter Rebbe was referring to. That various, not that various that you did and you rectified, that you stole money and then you gave back the money and you asked for forgiveness and the person gave you bleiv shalim. That's not the kind of avera that the Alter Rebbe was referring to. He's referring to an avera that a person does it and there is no rectification. They're sitting there, and no matter how much shava they do, they could always do more shava. Ultimately, though, we can make something good out of even these averas, even the averas like Zera L'Vatala, even the averas like chatas and neurim, whichever chatas and neurim it happens to be that we all have. That, or I don't know, we all have it, at least that I have. That we can look back and we can do something positive with it. We can use it to drive our aveda by thinking about it. Beitim zmanim, not too much, but not too little. Ultimately, we can make something good with everything. And yeah, that's the bracha. We should all make something good with everything. I'm gonna be happy with 36 minutes and like 20 seconds. L'chaim.